September 23, 1943. 02, 30 hours. 40 miles west of Truk Lagoon. Captain Shiro Takahashi stood on the bridge of the cargo vessel Kenwa Maru, watching the phosphorescent wake trail behind his ship in the darkness. The convoy of 7 transports had scattered after sunset, each captain choosing his own course, his own speed, his own desperate attempt to reach Rabaul alive. Takahashi had commanded merchant vessels for 19 years. He knew these waters. He had sailed this route 42 times since the war began. He understood the risks. American submarines patrolled every major shipping lane in the Pacific. But for 18 months, Takahashi and thousands of Japanese merchant officers like him had survived those patrols with a strange, terrible confidence. The American torpedoes did not work. Takahashi had watched American torpedoes strike his ship twice in April of 1942. Both hit with solid metallic clangs that shuddered through the hull. Neither exploded. His ship sailed on, damaged but afloat, crew shaken but alive. Other captains told similar stories. Torpedoes that detonated prematurely, hundreds of meters before reaching their targets. Torpedoes that passed underneath ships without exploding. Torpedoes that struck hull plates and simply bounced off, their warheads failing to detonate on contact. Japanese merchant officers did not understand why American torpedoes failed so consistently. They did not question their good fortune. They simply accepted it as another advantage in a war where advantages were desperately needed. The Americans had submarines. Japan had luck. That luck ended in August of 1943. Takahashi did not know that American submarine commanders had finally solved their torpedo problems through months of unauthorized testing and direct disobedience of orders from Washington. He did not know that Admiral Charles Lockwood had fired test torpedoes at fishing nets to prove the sate. Weapons ran 11 feet deeper than their depth settings indicated. He did not know that submarine captains had fired torpedoes at Hawaiian cliff faces to demonstrate that the magnetic influence exploders detonated prematurely, or not at all. What Takahashi knew was that in the past 30 days, 7 ships had disappeared from routes he sailed regularly, not damaged, not crippled, disappeared. Sunk so completely that rescue vessels found only debris fields and bodies floating in oil-slicked water. At 02:43 hours, the lookout on Kenwa Maru's starboard wing screamed a warning that was cut short by the sound every Japanese sailor had learned to dread. The churning wake of incoming torpedoes. Takahashi had perhaps 15 seconds. He ordered hard left rudder. The helmsman spun the wheel. The cargo ship, laden with 8,000 tons of ammunition and aviation fuel bound for Japanese air bases in Rabaul, began its turn with agonizing slowness. The first torpedo struck, amidships on the starboard side at 02:44 hours. The explosion tore through 3 cargo holds simultaneously. Aviation fuel ignited. The resulting fireball climbed 300 feet into the night sky, visible for 20 miles in every direction. Takahashi was thrown against the bridge windows by the concussion. When he regained his footing, he saw his ship breaking apart. The keel had snapped. The bow and stern sections were separating, each tilting at impossible angles as water rushed into the destroyed midsection. The second torpedo struck the bow section 8 seconds later. The forward magazine detonated. The bow simply vanished in a pressure wave that swept across the water and knocked men off the stern section 200 meters away. Takahashi did not have time to reach the lifeboat stations. The stern section rolled to starboard and capsized in less than 90 seconds from the first impact. He went into the water with 243 other crew members. The suction from the sinking stern pulled 87 men underwater. They did not resurface. When rescue vessels arrived at dawn, they found 112 survivors clinging to debris. Takahashi was among them. So was his executive officer, Lieutenant Hideaki Yamamoto, who had served aboard Kenwa Maru for 3 years. Yamamoto's first words to Takahashi, shouted across 10 meters of oil-covered water as they waited for rescue, captured what every Japanese merchant sailor was beginning to understand. The American torpedoes work now. We are all going to die. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The nightmare had begun for American submariners on December 7, 1941, not at Pearl Harbor, but in the minds of submarine commanders who had spent the previous decade training with a weapon that would betray them for 18 months, desperate combat. The Mark 14 torpedo was supposed to be the most advanced naval weapon in the world. Development had begun in the early 1930s at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. The weapon incorporated revolutionary technology that American ordnance experts believed would give United States submarines decisive superiority over any enemy. The torpedo was 20 feet 6 inches long, weighed 3,200 pounds, and carried a 663-pound Torpex warhead. It could reach 46 knots and had a range of 4,500 yards at that speed, or 9,000 yards at slower settings. Most significantly, it featured the Mark 6 magnetic influence exploder, a device designed to detonate the warhead when it passed through the magnetic field underneath a ship's keel. The theory was elegant. A torpedo exploding underneath a ship's keel would break the ship's back, snapping it in half far more effectively than a contact explosion against the side hull. The magnetic exploder would allow submarines to sink enemy vessels with fewer torpedoes, conserving weapons for extended patrols. The reality was catastrophic. The Mark 14 torpedo had never been tested with a live warhead before the war began. Live fire testing was considered too expensive. Each torpedo cost $10,000, equivalent to roughly $200,000 in modern currency. The Navy had authorized only 2 live fire tests of the magnetic exploder during the entire development period. Both tests were conducted in the magnetic environment near the equator, not in the higher latitudes where most Pacific combat would occur. The torpedo had never been tested at the depths where it would actually be used in combat. The depth mechanism had been calibrated using calculations and simulations, not actual underwater testing with live warheads. The contact exploder, the backup detonation system that was supposed to trigger if the magnetic exploder failed, had been copied from a German design captured during World War I. American ordnance engineers had modified the design without conducting adequate testing of how the modified mechanism would perform under combat conditions. In short, the United States Navy went to war with a torpedo that had been designed by committee, tested inadequately, and approved based on theoretical performance rather than demonstrated capability. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage of USS Trout discovered the problem on December 9, 1941, 2 days after Pearl Harbor. Trout was patrolling near Wake Island when Ramage's lookouts spotted a Japanese merchant vessel, anchored and unescorted, silhouetted against the dawn sky. It was a perfect target, the kind of shot submarine commanders dream about: stationary target at known range, calm seas, clear visibility. Ramage carefully calculated the firing solution. He approached to 1,500 yards, close enough that missing would be almost impossible. Trout fired 4 torpedoes. All 4 ran straight and true. Ramage watched through the periscope as each torpedo struck the merchant vessel's hull with clearly visible impacts. The sound carried across the water, solid metallic clangs like hammers striking iron plates. None of the 4 torpedoes exploded. The Japanese merchant vessel, completely unaware it had been attacked, raised anchor 20 minutes later and sailed away undamaged. Ramage filed a detailed report describing the incident. The report was read by submarine squadron commanders and forwarded to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington. The Bureau of Ordnance responded that the torpedoes had functioned correctly. The failure to detonate was attributed to operator error or improper maintenance procedures. Ramage's report was filed and forgotten. But Ramage was not the only submarine commander experiencing torpedo failures. Throughout December 1941 and January 1942, reports flooded in from submarine patrols across the Pacific. USS Sargo fired 13 torpedoes at perfect targets. 10 failed to explode. USS Skipjack fired 8 torpedoes at a Japanese battleship from ideal range. All 8 either exploded prematurely or failed to detonate on contact. USS Seawolf fired torpedoes at anchored transports in Davao Gulf. Multiple hits, multiple metallic clangs, 0 explosions. The pattern was undeniable to anyone actually reading the patrol reports. The Mark 14 torpedo was fundamentally defective, but the Bureau of Ordnance refused to acknowledge the problem. Rear Admiral William Blandy, Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, issued a statement in February 1942 defending the Mark 14 torpedo as technically sound and operationally effective. Blandy attributed the reported failures to inadequate training, improper maintenance, or cowardice among submarine commanders who were inventing excuses for poor performance. The suggestion that submarine commanders were cowards infuriated the submarine force. These were men risking their lives on extended patrols in enemy-controlled waters, attacking targets against overwhelming odds, and returning with detailed accounts of torpedo failures that the Bureau refused to investigate. The institutional response revealed a fundamental problem in how the United States Navy approached weapons development and testing. The Bureau of Ordnance had spent millions of dollars and more than a decade developing the Mark 14 torpedo. Senior officers had staked their careers on the weapon's success. Massive investments in manufacturing facilities and supply chains had been made based on the assumption that the Mark 14 would perform as designed. Admitting that the torpedo was defective would require acknowledging that the entire development process had been flawed, that testing procedures had been inadequate, and that senior leadership had approved a weapon for combat use without proper validation. The institutional and personal costs of such an admission were unacceptable to the officers responsible, so they blamed the submarine commanders instead. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton of USS Wahoo, one of the most aggressive and successful submarine skippers in the Pacific Fleet, fired 14 torpedoes during his first patrol in January 1943. 8 torpedoes ran under their targets without exploding. 4 torpedoes exploded prematurely, alerting the targets and allowing them to evade. 2 torpedoes hit and detonated properly, damaging but not sinking their target. Morton returned from patrol and filed a report that was brutally direct. The Mark 14 torpedo is unreliable, unpredictable, and unsuitable for combat operations. I cannot recommend its continued use without immediate and comprehensive investigation of all reported defects. Morton's report was classified and forwarded to Admiral Thomas Withers, commander of Submarine Forces in the Pacific. Withers read the report, agreed with Morton's assessment, and requested authorization to conduct independent testing of the Mark 14 torpedo to identify and correct the defects. The Bureau of Ordnance denied the request, but Morton and other submarine commanders were not willing to continue risking their lives and their crews with weapons they knew were defective. If the Bureau of Ordnance would not investigate the problems, submarine commanders would investigate themselves. The first breakthrough came in June 1942, when Admiral Robert English, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, ordered his staff to compile every torpedo failure report from the past 6 months and analyze them systematically for common patterns. The analysis revealed that torpedoes were consistently exploding prematurely when fired at targets from shallow depths or at oblique angles. The magnetic exploder was triggering too early, detonating the warhead before the torpedo reached its target. The magnetic influence system was extraordinarily sensitive to variations in the Earth's magnetic field, variations that changed with latitude, water temperature, and even the time of day. English ordered submarine commanders to deactivate the magnetic exploders and rely solely on contact detonation. The Bureau of Ordnance protested, arguing that deactivating the magnetic exploder violated proper torpedo employment doctrine and reduced weapon effectiveness. English ignored them. With magnetic exploders deactivated, premature explosions stopped, but the torpedoes still failed to sink ships. Now they were hitting targets and failing to detonate on contact. The second major defect was about to be discovered. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage, the same officer who had watched 4 torpedoes hit without exploding back in December 1941, conducted his own unauthorized test in October 1942. Ramage's submarine, USS Trout, was operating near Midway Island when he requested permission to fire a single torpedo at the steel cliff face of a small uninhabited island. His squadron commander approved the test, despite knowing it violated Bureau of Ordnance regulations against using torpedoes for unauthorized experiments. Trout fired one Mark 14 torpedo with the magnetic exploder deactivated at a cliff face from 800 yards. The torpedo struck the cliff with clearly audible impact. The warhead did not explode. The torpedo tumbled back into deep water, where increasing pressure finally triggered detonation at approximately 200 feet depth. Ramage retrieved the test data and forwarded it to Admiral English with a detailed analysis. The contact exploder was failing because it had been designed to work when torpedoes struck targets at oblique angles. When torpedoes hit at perpendicular angles, striking the target head-on, the firing pin in the contact exploder was crushed by the impact before it could trigger the detonator. The harder the torpedo hit its target, the less likely it was to explode. This was possibly the most absurd weapons failure in naval history. American submarines were firing torpedoes that worked better when they barely grazed their targets and failed completely when they scored perfect direct hits. Admiral English forwarded Ramage's findings to the Bureau of Ordnance with a formal request for immediate redesign of the contact exploder mechanism. The Bureau of Ordnance acknowledged the problem existed, but stated that redesigning and manufacturing new exploders for the entire torpedo inventory would require at least 18 months. English decided not to wait 18 months. In November 1942, he authorized submarine tenders to begin modifying contact exploders in the field, using basic machine shop tools. The modifications were crude but effective. Machinists strengthened the firing pin assemblies and adjusted the trigger mechanisms to be less sensitive to direct impact forces. The field modifications worked. Contact detonations became reliable. But there was still a third problem that nobody had identified yet. The torpedoes were running too deep. In March 1943, Admiral Charles Lockwood replaced Admiral English as commander of Submarine Forces Pacific after English was killed in an aircraft accident. Lockwood inherited the ongoing torpedo crisis and the growing frustration among submarine commanders who had watched targets escape for 18 months because their weapons did not work. Lockwood was an experienced submarine officer who had commanded submarines during World War I. Unlike the desk-bound bureaucrats at the Bureau of Ordnance, Lockwood understood submarines and submarine warfare from direct personal experience, and he was willing to challenge institutional authority when the lives of his submariners were at stake. Within weeks of taking command, Lockwood received reports from multiple T's repartees, submarine captains describing a consistent pattern. Torpedoes were passing underneath targets without exploding, even with magnetic exploders deactivated, and contact exploders modified for reliable detonation. Lockwood suspected the depth mechanism was faulty. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet depth were actually running deeper, passing under the keels of shallow draft vessels without making contact. But proving this required testing that the Bureau of Ordnance had never authorized. Lockwood decided to conduct the test anyway. In June 1943, Lockwood ordered a series of tests conducted in waters off Hawaii. Submarines would fire Mark 14 torpedoes at large fishing nets, suspended at precisely measured depths. If the torpedoes were running at their set depths, they would strike the nets. If they were running deeper than set, they would pass underneath. The results were irrefutable. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet depth passed underneath nets, suspended at 10 feet. They struck nets, suspended at 21 feet. The torpedoes were running 11 feet deeper than their depth settings across all tested ranges. Lockwood immediately ordered all submarine commanders to subtract 11 feet from their desired depth settings when programming torpedoes for firing. A torpedo needed to sink a destroyer with a draft of 15 feet would be set to run at 4 feet depth, ensuring it would actually run at 15 feet and hit the target. The depth problem was solved through subtraction rather than mechanical repair, a crude fix but an effective one. By August 1943, 18 months after the war began, American submarines finally had torpedoes that worked. Magnetic exploders were deactivated. Contact exploders were field-modified to detonate reliably. Depth settings were adjusted to compensate for the depth-keeping mechanism running 11 feet too deep. The weapon that emerged from this long nightmare of failures and fixes was not the sophisticated marvel the Bureau of Ordnance had designed. It was a crude, simple, contact-detonated torpedo that hit targets and exploded, exactly as torpedoes had been doing since World War I. But it worked, and that made all the difference. Japanese merchant marine officers and naval commanders did not understand what had changed. They only understood that suddenly, terrifyingly, American submarines had become death incarnate. The numbers told the story with brutal mathematical clarity. From December 1941 through July 1943, a period of 19 months, American submarines sank approximately 375 Japanese merchant vessels. This averaged roughly 20 ships per month. Given the torpedo failures that plagued the submarine force throughout this period, this was actually remarkable performance, achieved through aggressive tactics, excellent targeting intelligence from code-breaking operations, and sheer determination by submarine commanders who attacked despite knowing their weapons might fail. From August through October 1943, a period of 90 days, American submarines sank 201 Japanese merchant vessels, 201 ships in 90 days. More than 2 ships sunk every single day for 3 consecutive months. The sinking rate had increased by more than 500% virtually overnight. Japanese shipping losses in August 1943 totaled 142,000 tons. September losses reached 172,000 tons. October losses hit 134,000 tons. In 3 months, American submarines destroyed 448,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping, more tonnage than Japan could build in an entire year, even with every shipyard operating at maximum capacity. The empire's logistics network, already strained by 2 years of war, began to collapse under losses it could not sustain or replace. Captain Masao Nishida commanded the destroyer Shikinami, assigned to escort duty for convoy High 17 in September 1943. The convoy consisted of 9 transport vessels carrying troops and supplies from Singapore to Rabaul, a route that had become increasingly dangerous as American submarine activity intensified throughout the summer. Nishida's orders were straightforward: protect the transports, engage enemy submarines, ensure the convoy reached Rabaul with minimal losses. Standard escort doctrine called for destroyers to form a protective screen around the transports, using sonar to detect submerged submarines and depth charges to destroy them once located. The convoy departed Singapore on September 12, 1943. On September 14th, at 21:30 hours, torpedoes struck two transports almost simultaneously. Both ships sank within minutes. Nishida's destroyer raced toward the attack position, dropping depth charges in a standard search pattern. The submarine escaped, undetected. On September 15th, at 03:20 hours, torpedoes hit another transport. The ship broke in half and sank in less than 4 minutes. Nishida's sonar operators detected nothing. The submarine had attacked, struck its target, and vanished before escorts could respond. On September 16th, at 1400 hours in broad daylight, torpedoes struck two more transports simultaneously from different directions, two submarines attacking in coordinated wolfpack tactics. Nishida ordered his destroyer to pursue one contact, while the other escort vessel pursued the second. Both submarines escaped without damage. The convoy, which had left Singapore with 9 transports, reached Rabaul on September 19th with 4 ships remaining. 5 transports sunk in 7 days, over 4,000 tons of supplies lost. 1,300 Japanese soldiers and merchant sailors dead. Nishida filed his after-action report on September 21st. The report was classified and forwarded to the Combined Fleet headquarters for analysis. The conclusion was inescapable and terrifying. American submarine effectiveness has increased dramatically in recent months. Previous torpedo failures that allowed damaged vessels to survive are no longer occurring. Every torpedo hit now results in catastrophic damage or total loss. Escort forces cannot detect or engage submarines before they attack. Current defensive measures are inadequate against this threat level. The report landed on the desk of Captain Atsushi Oi, staff officer responsible for anti-submarine warfare doctrine at Combined Fleet headquarters. Oi had been reading similar reports for weeks. Every escort commander was reporting the same pattern. American torpedoes that had been unreliable and frequently defective throughout 1942 were now working with devastating effectiveness. Oi requested data from the Naval Intelligence Division on American submarine patrol, reports captured from downed aircraft or recovered from destroyed submarines. The analysis revealed something Japanese intelligence had missed until that moment. American submarine patrol reports from 1942 frequently mentioned torpedo failures, premature explosions, and failure to detonate on contact. Captured American documents included complaints from submarine commanders about defective torpedoes and requests for improved weapons reliability. Patrol reports from August 1943 onward mentioned no such problems. American submarines were firing torpedoes that hit targets and exploded with consistent, reliable lethality. The Americans had fixed their torpedo problems, and Japanese shipping was paying the price. Admiral Koshiro Oikawa, commander of the Third Fleet, received an urgent communication from Naval General Staff Headquarters on October 3, 1943. The message was brief and unprecedented in its directness. Merchant shipping losses have reached critical levels. Current attrition rate will exhaust available tonnage within 8 months. All fleet operations must prioritize convoy protection over offensive action until shipping crisis is resolved. Oikawa read the message twice, attempting to comprehend what it meant for Japanese naval strategy. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been designed, trained, and equipped for decisive fleet engagement against enemy warships. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers were meant to seek out and destroy American naval forces in climactic battles that would determine control of the Pacific. Now those same warships were being ordered to escort merchant convoys. The most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled was being reduced to defensive protection duty because American submarines were sinking cargo ships faster than shipyards could replace them. The strategic implications were catastrophic. Every destroyer assigned to convoy escort was a destroyer unavailable for fleet operations. Every cruiser protecting transports was a cruiser that could not support carrier task forces. Every patrol aircraft searching for submarines was an aircraft that could not conduct reconnaissance against American naval movements. The Americans were forcing Japan to choose between protecting its logistics network and maintaining offensive naval capability. And the mathematics of the situation meant Japan could not do both. Oikawa understood what the Naval General Staff would not explicitly state in official communications. The war was being lost one cargo ship at a time, and there was nothing the combined fleet could do to stop it. Lieutenant Koji Tanaka served aboard the cargo vessel Kenwa Maru, a 4,800-ton transport that had survived 7 convoy runs between Japan and the southern resource areas since the war began. Tanaka was a reserve officer, called up from his civilian position as a merchant marine navigator when the war started. He had no military training beyond basic seamanship and navigation. He was 26 years old. On October 8, 1943, Kenwa Maru departed Truk as part of Convoy High 22, bound for Rabaul with ammunition, aviation fuel, and replacement aircraft engines desperately needed by Japanese air units in the Solomon Islands. The convoy consisted of 6 transports escorted by 2 destroyers and 4 sub-chasers. Tanaka stood the midnight to 0400 watch on October 10th. The sea was calm. Visibility was poor due to overcast skies blocking starlight. The convoy maintained radio silence and blacked out all external lights to avoid detection. At 02:15 hours, Tanaka heard the sound that had become every Japanese sailor's nightmare. The churning wake of multiple torpedoes approaching from starboard. He shouted the alarm. The captain ordered emergency turn to port. The helmsman threw the wheel hard over. Kenwa Maru began its turn with agonizing slowness, laden with 8,000 tons of cargo that resisted rapid maneuvering. The first torpedo struck the engine room. The explosion killed 16 men instantly and destroyed the main steam plant. The ship lost power. Emergency lighting failed. The vessel went dark and dead in the water. The second torpedo hit forward of the bridge, striking the hold containing aviation fuel. The resulting explosion was visible 30 miles away, a column of orange flame that climbed 200 feet into the night sky and illuminated the entire convoy. Tanaka was thrown through the bridge windows by the concussion. He landed on the deck below with a broken left arm and lacerations across his face and chest. When he regained consciousness, perhaps 30 seconds later, the ship was listing heavily to starboard, and fires were spreading from the ruptured fuel tanks. He made his way to the boat deck. Half the lifeboats had been destroyed by the explosions. The remaining boats were being overwhelmed by panicked crew members, fighting to board. Tanaka watched men fall into the water as overcrowded lifeboats capsized. He watched other men jump from the tilting deck and strike debris in the water, their bodies going limp on impact. He did not attempt to reach the lifeboats. He jumped from the starboard rail into the water, swimming away from the ship as fast as his injured arm would allow. Behind him, Kenwa Maru rolled completely over and sank bow first. The stern rose vertically, propeller still turning slowly, then slid beneath the surface. From launch of the first torpedo to complete disappearance beneath the waves, 3 minutes and 40 seconds had elapsed. Tanaka floated in the oil-covered water for 6 hours before being rescued by a sub-chaser that was searching the area for survivors. Of Kenwa Maru's crew of 183 men, 47 survived. 136 died, most trapped below decks when the ship sank or killed by the explosions that destroyed the vessel. When Tanaka was pulled aboard the subchaser, burned and half-conscious from exposure and blood loss, the first thing he asked the rescue crew was whether anyone had seen the submarine that attacked them. Nobody had. The submarine had fired, struck its targets, and vanished without ever being detected by the convoy's escorts. Tanaka spent 2 weeks recovering in a naval hospital in Truk. While he was there, he spoke with other survivors from other ships sunk during the same period. Every conversation followed the same pattern: torpedoes appearing from darkness without warning, explosions that destroyed ships in minutes, submarines that escaped before escorts could respond, bodies floating in burning oil, screaming men trapped below decks as compartments flooded, and the universal, helpless terror of knowing that the next convoy, the next voyage, would likely end the same way. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The human cost of the 90-day slaughter extended far beyond the 201 ships that went to the bottom. Each sinking killed merchant sailors, naval personnel, and often hundreds or thousands of Japanese soldiers being transported to reinforce distant garrisons. Transport Kenwa Maru was torpedoed on August 27, 1943, while carrying the 41st Infantry Regiment from Shanghai to Rabaul. The ship sank in 4 minutes. Of the 3,200 soldiers aboard, only 840 survived. 2,400 men drowned, most trapped in locked troop compartments below the waterline that flooded instantly when torpedoes ruptured the hull. Cargo vessel Noto Maru was sunk on September 15, 1943, with a cargo of artillery ammunition and 1,200 tons of rice destined for Japanese forces in New Guinea. The explosion when torpedoes struck the ammunition holds was so massive that debris rained down on escort vessels 2,000 meters away. The entire crew of 96 men died instantly. Tanker Kenwa Maru was torpedoed on October 2, 1943, while carrying aviation fuel from the Dutch East Indies to Truk. The tanker, fully loaded with 12,000 barrels of high-octane gasoline, exploded in a fireball that burned for 40 minutes on the surface of the water. The heat was so intense that rescue vessels could not approach. 123 crew members died, many of them burned alive in the initial explosion or drowned when they jumped into burning fuel floating on the water. The statistics were compiled by the Naval Transport Command in Tokyo, tabulated with bureaucratic precision even as the numbers revealed a catastrophe beyond anything Japan had experienced in its naval history. August 1943. 63 merchant vessels sunk, 142,000 tons lost, estimated 4,800 personnel killed. September 1943. 74 merchant vessels sunk, 172,000 tons lost, estimated 6,100 personnel killed. October 1943. 64 merchant vessels sunk, 134,000 tons lost, estimated 5,400 personnel killed. 3 months. 201 ships, 448,000 tons, 16,300 deaths. And the losses were accelerating. November would be worse. December would be catastrophic. Captain Tamechi Hara commanded the destroyer Shigure, one of the few Japanese destroyers to survive the entire Pacific War from Pearl Harbor to the surrender. Hara's memoirs, published after the war, provided a rare first-hand account of what Japanese naval officers understood about the shipping crisis during this period. Hara wrote, "By late 1943, we knew we were losing the war at sea, not through climactic battles where Japanese courage and training might make a difference, but through the slow strangulation of our merchant fleet American submarines were everywhere. They attacked with torpedoes that actually worked, unlike the defective weapons they had used earlier in the war. Our escorts could not find them, could not hurt them, could not stop them. I spoke with merchant captains who had survived submarine attacks. Every one of them described the same experience. Sailing through darkness, knowing submarines were watching, hearing torpedoes in the water, watching their ships disintegrate around them, floating in oil-covered water, hoping for rescue that often came too late or not at all. The Americans were not just sinking our ships, they were killing our ability to sustain the war. Every transport sunk was a transport that would never deliver troops to the Philippines, never bring oil from the Dutch East Indies, never carry ammunition to our island garrisons. We could not build ships fast enough to replace losses. We could not train merchant crews fast enough to replace the dead. We were being bled to death by an enemy we could not see and could not fight. The strategic impact of the 90-day period extended beyond the immediate shipping losses. Japan's entire defensive strategy for the Pacific depended on the ability to reinforce threatened positions before American forces could overwhelm them. That strategy required functioning sea lines of communication from Japan to the resource areas of Southeast Asia and the defensive perimeter islands. American submarines were severing those sea lines systematically. Operation Roe, Japan's planned reinforcement of Rabaul with air units from the Marianas, was scheduled for October 1943. The operation required transporting 150 aircraft, their maintenance equipment, fuel, ammunition, and support personnel from Truk to Rabaul via convoy. 3 separate convoys attempted the run in October. American submarines sank 4 of the 7 transports carrying aviation equipment and fuel. The remaining 3 transports arrived with less than 40% of the intended cargo. The aircraft reached Rabaul, but lacked the fuel, ammunition, and spare parts needed for sustained operations. Operation Roe failed not because American forces defeated Japanese aircraft in combat, but because American submarines prevented the supplies needed to sustain those aircraft from reaching their destination. The same pattern played out across every Japanese defensive position in the Pacific. Truk needed fuel oil to operate as a major naval base. Submarines sank the tankers, bringing oil from the Dutch East Indies. The Marshall Islands needed food to sustain their garrisons. Submarines sank the cargo vessels carrying rice from Japan. The Solomon Islands needed ammunition. Submarines sank the transports before they could deliver their cargo. By late 1943, Japanese garrisons throughout the Pacific were being systematically isolated and starved of supplies, while American submarines controlled the sea lanes that should have connected them to the home islands. Warrant Officer Haruo Yoshino served in the Naval Transport Command headquarters in Tokyo, responsible for scheduling convoy routes and allocating available merchant tonnage to military requirements. His post-war testimony, provided during interviews with American naval historians, revealed how completely the shipping crisis dominated Japanese strategic planning. Yoshino recalled, "We had requests from field commanders for more than 2 million tons of shipping per month to move troops, equipment, and supplies where they were needed. We had less than 800,000 tons of available merchant vessels, after accounting for ships under repair, ships assigned to civilian food transport, and ships lost to submarine attack in the previous month. Every day, I received new reports of ships sunk. Every day, the available tonnage decreased. Every day, the gap between what commanders needed and what we could provide grew larger. We were prioritizing desperately. Which garrison gets food this month, and which garrison goes on reduced rations? Which offensive operation gets transport support, and which operation is cancelled for lack of shipping? The Americans did not need to invade every island to defeat us. They just needed to sink enough ships that we could not defend the islands we already held. By late 1943, that is exactly what was happening. Our garrisons were withering from lack of supplies, while we watched helplessly, unable to deliver the food, ammunition, and fuel they needed because submarines controlled the sea routes. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant mariners who survived submarine attacks was profound and lasting. These men were not trained combat personnel. They were civilian sailors, many of them pressed into service, assigned to vessels they knew were likely to be sunk. They sailed into submarine-infested waters because duty demanded it and because refusing meant disgrace or court-martial. Seaman Ichiro Nakamura survived the sinking of 3 different vessels between August and November 1943. His account, recorded in a 1978 oral history project documenting Japanese merchant marine experiences, captured the terror that defined this period. After the first sinking, I was afraid every time I went to sea. After the second sinking, I was certain I would die on the third voyage. After the third sinking, I refused to board another ship. They arrested me for desertion and threatened court-martial. I did not care. I told them they could shoot me on land or let the submarines kill me at sea. Either way, I was dead. At least on land, it would be quick. Every sailor knew the American torpedoes were working now. In 1942, you might survive a torpedo hit because the torpedo failed to explode, or exploded in the wrong place. By late 1943, if a torpedo hit your ship, you were almost certainly going to die. The only question was how long it would take for the ship to sink and whether you could reach a lifeboat before it went down. I watched men jump into burning water. I watched men drown because they could not swim and there were not enough lifeboats. I watched men pulled underwater by the suction when ships sank. I heard men screaming inside flooded compartments, trapped behind steel doors that could not be opened because the pressure differential was too great. These sounds never leave you. 40 years later, I still hear them in my dreams. The American submarine commanders who were achieving these results operated with a level of effectiveness that exceeded even their own expectations. The combination of functioning torpedoes, excellent intelligence from code-breaking operations, and aggressive tactics created conditions where skilled submarine crews could devastate entire convoys. Commander Dudley Morton of USS Wahoo conducted a patrol in October 1943 that exemplified the new era of American submarine warfare. Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor on September 13th with 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, all with magnetic exploders deactivated and contact exploders field-modified for reliable detonation. Morton's patrol area was the Sea of Japan, accessed through the heavily defended Tsushima Strait. Japanese naval commanders considered the Sea of Japan relatively safe from submarine attack because the strait's shallow waters and strong currents made submerged transit dangerous. Morton transited the strait on the surface at night, using radar to avoid patrol vessels. Once inside the Sea of Japan, he found target-rich waters. Merchant shipping between Japan and Korea moved without heavy escorts because Japanese commanders believed submarines could not penetrate the Sea of Japan in significant numbers. Between September 20th and October 5th, Wahoo sank 9 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 20,700 tons. Morton fired 19 torpedoes, 16 hit their targets, 15 detonated properly. 9 ships sunk. The patrol was a tactical masterpiece. Morton had proven that American submarines could operate successfully in waters Japan considered secure. He had demonstrated the reliability of the corrected torpedoes by achieving an 84% hit rate and a 94% detonation rate among hits. And he had sent a clear message to Japanese naval commanders. Nowhere was safe. No shipping route could be considered secure. American submarines were hunting in every ocean area, including the Sea of Japan itself. Morton did not survive the war. Wahoo was sunk by Japanese anti-submarine forces in October 1943, likely during her exit transit through La Pérouse Strait. All 89 crew members died. Morton was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his aggressive and effective command of Wahoo throughout her combat career. But the tactics Morton pioneered, the confidence in reliable torpedoes that his patrol demonstrated, these became standard for the entire submarine force. Other commanders followed Morton into the Sea of Japan. Other submarines attacked with the same aggressive determination, knowing their weapons would work when they fired. The 90-day period from August through October 1943 marked the transition from torpedo crisis to torpedo dominance. American submarines went from frustrated hunters firing defective weapons to the most lethal anti-shipping force in naval history. The impact on Japanese merchant marine morale was catastrophic and measurable. In August 1943, approximately 300 Japanese merchant officers requested transfer from sea duty to shore assignments. In September, that number increased to 700. By October, over 1,000 merchant officers had filed formal requests to be relieved from ship assignments. The Naval Transport Command denied most requests, threatening court-martial for any officer who refused orders. But threats could not restore confidence among men who were sailing to their deaths. By late 1943, Japanese merchant vessels were being crewed by impressed sailors with minimal training, officers who had failed to secure shore assignments, and merchant marines who had no other employment options. The quality of Japanese merchant crews declined dramatically, just as the threat they faced was increasing. Ships were being operated by skeleton crews, who lacked the training and experience to execute effective damage control when torpedoes struck. This made sinkings even more catastrophic. Vessels that might have survived single torpedo hits with experienced crews sank rapidly when inexperienced sailors could not contain flooding or fight fires effectively. Captain Yoshio Kodama, a merchant marine officer who survived the entire war despite commanding 5 different vessels that were sunk under him, described the deterioration of crew quality in his post-war memoirs. By late 1943, I was being assigned crews who had perhaps 6 weeks of training. These were not sailors. These were factory workers and farmers who had been drafted, given basic instruction in operating deck machinery, and sent to sea. When my ship was hit by torpedoes in November 1943, half my crew did not know how to properly abandon ship. They jumped from the wrong side of the vessel, directly into the path of the sinking ship's suction. They drowned because they had never been taught proper evacuation procedures. The experienced sailors were all dead. They had died on ships sunk earlier in the war. We were replacing them with men who should never have been sent to sea. But we had no choice. The ships had to sail. The army needed supplies. The garrisons needed to food. So we sailed with whoever we could find to crew the vessels, knowing that most of them would die on their first or second voyage. The strategic calculations that had informed Japanese war planning were becoming irrelevant in the face of shipping losses that could not be sustained. Japan had begun the war with 6.4 million tons of merchant shipping. By late 1943, available tonnage had fallen to 3.8 million tons. New construction during 1943 added approximately 650,000 tons of new merchant vessels. Submarine attacks alone sunk 1.8 million tons during the same period. The Japanese merchant fleet was shrinking by more than 1 million tons per year, despite maximum construction efforts. At that attrition rate, Japan would lose the capacity to transport resources from the southern territories to the home islands within 18 months. The war economy would collapse, not because factories were destroyed, but because raw materials could not reach the factories. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of Naval General Staff, submitted a confidential assessment to the Imperial War Council on November 2, 1943. The assessment was blunt and unambiguous. Merchant shipping losses have reached unsustainable levels. American submarine effectiveness increased dramatically in recent months, coinciding with apparent resolution of torpedo defects that limited their success earlier in the war. Current attrition rates will exhaust our merchant fleet capacity within 2 years. Without significant reduction in shipping losses or dramatic increase in new construction, our ability to wage war will be determined entirely by logistics constraints rather than combat capability. We cannot defeat the American submarine force with available anti-submarine resources. We lack sufficient escort vessels, effective radar and sonar, and adequate air patrol coverage. American submarines operate with intelligence advantage that allows them to position optimally before convoys arrive. They attack with reliable weapons. They employ coordinated wolf-pack tactics. Our defensive measures have failed to reduce their effectiveness. The strategic implications are absolute. We are losing the war at sea. We will continue losing until merchant shipping capacity falls below minimum threshold required to sustain industrial production and military operations. At current loss rates, that threshold will be reached in late 1945. We must accept either negotiated settlement before that occurs or face complete economic collapse and inevitable military defeat. The assessment was read by senior military and government leadership. It was discussed in multiple cabinet meetings and strategic planning sessions, and it was filed and ignored. Japan's political and military culture in 1943 did not permit acknowledging that the war was lost. Officers who suggested negotiated settlement risked being labelled defeatist or cowardly. Government officials who proposed peace talks faced potential assassination by ultranationalist factions that demanded continued resistance regardless of strategic realities. The institutional incentives all pointed toward continuing the war, even when senior leadership understood privately that victory was impossible. The submarine campaign that was destroying Japan's merchant fleet, the mathematics showing that collapse was inevitable. These truths could not be spoken publicly or acted upon without triggering political crisis. So the war continued. The convoys continued sailing, the submarines continued hunting, and the ships continued sinking, 2 per day throughout the 90-day slaughter, then 3 per day through the winter of 1943 into 44, then 4 per day by mid-44. The final accounting of the period from August through October 1943 reveals numbers that demonstrate how completely functional torpedoes transformed American submarine effectiveness. 201 Japanese merchant vessels sunk in 90 days, 448,000 tons of shipping destroyed, 16,300 Japanese personnel killed, over 100,000 tons of military supplies sent to the bottom, 26 convoys attacked, with average losses exceeding 30% of vessels in each convoy. American submarine losses during the same period totaled 4 submarines, sunk with 312 crew members killed. The exchange ratio was catastrophically one-sided. For every American submarine lost, Japanese shipping losses averaged 112,000 tons and over 4,000 personnel. No military campaign in history achieved such strategic impact with such minimal friendly losses. The psychological transformation of the conflict was equally significant. Japanese merchant sailors who had sailed with cautious confidence through 1942, knowing American torpedoes often failed, were sailing in terror by late 1943, knowing that torpedo hits meant certain death. American submarine crews who had endured 18 months of frustration, firing weapons that did not work, were operating with aggressive confidence by August 1943, knowing their torpedoes would hit and explode exactly as designed. The 90-day period marked the point where American submarine warfare transitioned from experimental weapon system plagued by defects to the dominant force in the Pacific Naval War. Every strategic calculation Japan had made about sustainable shipping losses, about defensive perimeter requirements, about the viability of extended supply lines, all became obsolete when American torpedoes started working reliably. Commander Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb, one of the most successful submarine commanders of the Pacific War, wrote in his patrol report from October 1943, "The torpedo problems that plagued us for the first 18 months of the war are resolved. We can now hunt with confidence that our weapons will perform as designed." The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Submarine commanders who were cautious because they could not trust their weapons are now aggressive because we know every torpedo we fire will either hit and explode or miss cleanly. The Japanese do not understand what changed. They only know that suddenly their ships are sinking at rates they cannot sustain. From our perspective, we have simply been given weapons that work. But from their perspective, American submarines have somehow become dramatically more lethal overnight. The terror this creates among Japanese merchant crews is visible in their behavior. Ships break formation and run when they detect us. Crews abandon ship at the first torpedo hit, rather than attempting damage control. Their morale has collapsed. The Japanese merchant marine never recovered from the 90-day slaughter. The period from August through October 1943 broke the psychological resilience of merchant crews who had endured 2 years of war. After experiencing the sudden catastrophic increase in American submarine effectiveness, Japanese merchant sailors understood with absolute clarity that sailing into submarine-patrolled waters meant probable death. That understanding, spread through thousands of survivors who returned from sunk vessels, created a culture of fear and resignation that pervaded the entire merchant fleet for the remainder of the war. Seaman Takeshi Hayashi, who survived the sinking of cargo vessel Kenwa Maru in September 1943, spent 6 weeks in hospital recovering from injuries and exposure. When he was discharged and ordered to report for assignment to a new vessel, he described his psychological state in later interviews. "I knew I was going to die. Not possibly die. Not probably die. Certainly die. It was only a question of when. First voyage, second voyage, maybe third if I was lucky. But the submarines would get me eventually. Everyone knew it. We talked about it openly. Which was worse, burning to death when aviation fuel exploded, or drowning in a flooded compartment? Would you rather die quickly from the torpedo hit itself, or slowly from exposure floating in the water waiting for rescue that might not come? We sailed anyway because we had no choice. The alternative was court-martial and execution for desertion. So we chose probable death at sea over certain death by firing squad. And we hoped we would be lucky, that our ship would be one that survived, that we would be one of the survivors if our ship sank. Hope was all we had. Hope and the certain knowledge that eventually our luck would run out. By November 1943, Japanese merchant shipping had entered a death spiral from which it would never recover. Losses exceeded replacement capacity. Experienced crews were dead, replaced by untrained personnel who died even faster. Convoy routes that had been relatively safe earlier in the war were now killing grounds where American submarines waited with weapons that worked. The 90-day period when American torpedoes finally functioned reliably did not just sink 201 ships. It broke the Japanese merchant marine psychologically, destroyed Japan's ability to sustain its logistics network, and set in motion the economic collapse that would make Japan's defeat inevitable, regardless of how courageously Japanese forces fought in subsequent battles. Commander Lawson Ramage, the submarine officer who had watched 4 torpedoes hit without exploding back in December 1941, conducted a patrol in November 1943 aboard USS Parche. During that patrol, Ramage fired 16 torpedoes at Japanese vessels. 15 hit their targets. All 15 exploded on contact. Parche sank 5 merchant vessels, totaling 18,000 tons in a single patrol. Ramage's patrol report included a brief personal note that captured how far the submarine force had come in 24 months. December 1941, I fired 4 torpedoes at a stationary target from ideal range. All 4 hit. None exploded. The target sailed away undamaged while we watched helplessly. November 1943, I fired 16 torpedoes at moving targets in poor visibility. 15 hit and detonated as designed. 5 enemy vessels destroyed. The difference is not in submarine crew skill or tactical execution. The difference is that we finally have weapons that work. Everything else follows from that. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.